The Missing Children Incident. Chapter 7. The Mascot Murderer. Most parents arrived at 6 p.m. for their kids, but many of them were there earlier. The children were tired but happy, except a few younger ones who cried from exhaustion. The staff started to tidy the hall and everything went fast and nice, just as it should. Scott was counting the minutes left until he can leave. He thought maybe an hour or so, but suddenly a worried-looking woman approached him. "Excuse me, sir. Do you know where my kids are? I'm looking for 5 kids, 2 girls and 3 boys. Oh, I'm sure they are rambling somewhere here," he said, barely listening. "But I was looking everywhere. Where else can they be? Maybe back at the Pirate Cove?" "It's out of order," said Scott, but they walked to the Pirate Cove anyway. They even peeked behind the curtain, but nothing. "So, they are not here." Scott scratched his head. "Maybe in the bathroom." But they weren't in the bathroom either. The woman got more and more nervous, and her nervousness kind of infected Scott too. He had already asked more about the kids and he had the idea who they were searching for, but he just didn't know where they could be. He checked the door which led into the back corridors, but it was closed, as it had to be. "Maybe they went home?" he asked finally. "I don't remember that they were here when we served the birthday cakes." "It's possible." The woman seemed to grab into this idea. "We live near. It's 10 minutes with a car. Or maybe they went into the park, although I told them not to leave this place." "You should check it," suggested Scott. "They could be home already." The woman nodded nervously and rushed away. Scott asked his people in the hall, who already finished almost everything and wanted to leave. Most of them had no idea who was he talking about. They were so busy with their own business that they barely listened to anything else. One of the guards, Mark remembered, but he was quite uncertain, that he saw several kids leaving the building. Barney confirmed it, and even more. He recognized one of the missing kids among the kids who was playing in the parking lot. Scott wondered how he knew that, since Barney was actually just strolling in the diner and was barely seen at the party. Meanwhile, the woman came back with more worried parents. They checked the whole restaurant again. They even went into the kitchen, although the cooks said that nobody entered the kitchen without their detection. Scott opened the back corridors, but they only looked in and then closed it again. It was sure that nobody was in here. The whole thing was locked, with more locked rooms and garbage. One of the parents called the police. They asked some questions and then left with the parents and formed some search teams. It was clear that the kids are not in the restaurant anymore. They probably left, wanted to go home, but something happened to them outside, or they just completely forgot about time and playing in the park. It was a nice summer weather and it was clear for almost the early evening hours. Scott could only leave 2 hours later than he usually did, and he was upset. He left some instructions for Barney, what he should do if he discovers the kids while he is on the night shift. But he still wasn't relaxed. It was really upsetting that if something happened to those kids, it will be his fault. But how could he listen even more? Barney knew that the parents will make a fuss if the kids are missing, but that was how he expected it. Everyone will think that they left the place. Fortunately, that guy Mark mentioned that before Barney would do it. so he just had to uphold it. They didn't even check the security cameras. Everyone was searching for the kids outside. When they checked into the locked corridor, he was jittering that they did check it too carefully. It was closed anyway. No one could have entered, especially no kids, right? Luckily, the parents and the police were on the same opinion and they also didn't enter and look around. It was also a weak point of his plan that what if the police want to check the security cameras, although two persons said that they saw the kids leaving, but it also didn't happen. They can check those cameras a few days later, but if they'd found the kids too early, when they are still alive, it would ruin his fun. Not as those kids could tell the police anything else beside what they saw on the cameras, and he made sure not to be recognizable. He tried to avoid the cameras while moving around and also didn't look into them. Being so close to his purpose made waiting even harder. The parents and the police left, but Scott stayed for a while. He seemed very worried. No surprise, since all the responsibility was his, and Barney felt a bit guilty because he thought Scott as a friend and didn't want any trouble for him. Finally Scott left too. Barney waited a bit anyway, tried to find some activity for himself. He led the old robots to the door of the locked corridor. He will need them later. He turned them off to prevent them roaming away. Foxy was inside, in one of the storage rooms, since he was still malfunctioning, but he will need him too. He will take care of him later. He didn't want to enter the locked area, not yet, because he could barely stand waiting even out here, knowing the kids are in there, waiting for him in the back room. He readied that room earlier, and mixed their drinks with some sleeping pills which will sedate them until he finally have time to play with them. He found it rather funny, and also exciting, that the parents were looking for their children everywhere, but they had no idea that they were sleeping just a few doors away from them, tied to their chairs. It was him, of course, who wore the spring Bonnie costume. It was his first time wearing it, and it was just as horrible as Kyle and the others told him. It stinked and it was tight. He could barely see out from its mask. He almost kicked some toddlers who were crossing his path. It was so uncomfortable under his arms and between his legs that he could only walk like a retarded, which made the kids think that he was a real robot, not a person in a suit. Since he couldn't talk, not to reveal his identity, and he could barely move his arms, he was afraid that the kids didn't understand what he was trying to tell them. Fortunately they didn't disappoint him. They were smart enough. The back storage room was ready for the attraction. He moved most stuff there days before the party, like the desk, the chairs, the bin liners and a toolbox filled with ropes and different tools. He hadn't decided what he wanted to use. Barehand method worked perfectly for him so far. He will surely use it again, but he wanted something more spectacular. He prepared an axe, a hammer and a wrench. No knife, because if something really messed up situation occurs, some of the kids can obey the knife and wound Barney with it. No, the others will be enough. They felt much more interesting, especially the hammer. He swung it a few times, and it seemed perfect, like it was the continuation of his arm. He will feel every single hit and every crack of bones with it. It was a very exciting thought. He was also curious how seeing and smelling blood would affect him, because there will be a lot of blood. He only saw a lot of blood once, when he was 15. He was going on a hunt with his father and his father's friends. They shot a deer. There was a lot of blood, beautifully coloring the snow, and Barney remembered its heavy, metallic smell, but it wasn't human blood, or child's blood, so he was hungry for this new experience. He brought there some cleaning tools too. Hopefully he will need them. If not, he can tell that he missed a perfect opportunity. He thought the children less and less as persons with the same rights as him, like persons who were talking to, who were helping to open their drinks and covered them when they damaged the property of the restaurant. They were his prey now, a group of scared, helpless prey. It was dark outside. He thought he had waited long enough. It's time to have fun. The whole place is his now, and he had a whole night to play with those little shits. Finn regained his consciousness slowly. Everything was dark and dim. He tried to blink, but it wasn't easy. His eyelids moved lazily and he had to fight to prevent them closing again. His head felt heavy. He could barely lift it to look around. For a moment, he had no idea where he was. Dark, messy room, old, broken furniture. And before him, Jenny and the others, sitting next to the table. Yes, the table. Spring Bonnie and the birthday cake. Memories started to return. He tried to move, but something was wrong. His arms. They were stretched back and they were not moving. A rope pressed against his wrists. There was also something on his face. He felt the taste of some dirty fabric. He tried to spit it out in disgust. He saw it that the others' mouths are tied too and their arms are also stretched back. They didn't move. Some of them were lying with their face on the table. The others sat in odd angles, their heads hanging back, and in the middle, that goddamned cake was still there. Finn started to push his arms, and he felt the rope is loosening. It wasn't tied too carefully. Maybe the person who did this to them thought they are not awake before his return. The boy felt an icy chill move down his back as he thought of who could do this and why. But then he discarded it. There will be time to think about this later. Now they have more important things to do. Get free and run away as fast as they can. With renewed vigor, he started to push the rope again when he heard a whimper from the other side of the table. Betty started to wake up as she saw the others. Recognition and fright appeared in her eyes. "Hey," Finn said, but his voice was oddly rusty. Betty looked at him with the look of a scared little kitty. When she recognized Finn, she relaxed a bit. "Free your hands," said Finn, clearing his throat to sound less grim. "I've almost succeeded. Mine is not tied so tight. We'll free the others and leave without a trace." Betty also tried pushing H's arms and tried to get rid of fabric stuffed into her mouth. He was mostly able to get rid of it, but the rope on her arms didn't loose. "I can't," she cried. "It doesn't want to come loose, Finn." She started to twitching on the chair, really hysterically. "Hey, calm down. You will pull out a joint, slowly, carefully, and it will let you go, you know, as they did in the Blackbeard comics." The others also regained their consciousness slowly, blinking and spitting out the fabrics. "What's this, Finn?" asked Betty, with tears in her eyes. "Why are we here? Who has done this to us?" "I know as much as you do," Finn answered. He felt his blood pulsing in his ears, like it was yelling "Run! Run!" But he saw the others staring at him, waiting for him to solve the problem. He gulped and tried to seem as wise as an adult. "When we are out, we will have plenty of time to think about this. Dad will find out who it was and he will kick him in the ass." The children gave forth a weak, wobbly laugh, which died fast. "Why did Bonnie lead us here?" muttered Joey. "Did he know that someone's gonna hurt us, or was it him, all alone?" "You are talking nonsense," said Jenny, but her voice was trembling. "He's just a machine. He has no will." Just in that moment, they heard keys ringing and the door of the S'Trage room opened. They all looked there, fear and hope in their widened eyes. The man who walked in was really familiar. It was Miles, the security guard of Fazbear's who once helped them to cover up that broke toy Foxy. Finn cheered up when he saw him, but his happy cry died before he came out. When he saw his face, he wasn't surprised or shocked, and the way he walked in was very conscious, and this could mean only one thing. But before Finn could think it through or say a word, Betty's voice exclaimed from the other side of the desk, "Mr. Miles, thanks for arriving." She went into tears from relief. She didn't seem to notice, nor the others, that Miles didn't act like a savior, like any adult who would be shocked seeing them tied to their chairs, or they just didn't want to see it. "We are so happy that you came to rescue us. We are so lucky that you were here," hollered Joey while pushing his bondage. "It's not even close how happy I am," said Miles with a wide smile which seemed really out of place. "But I think you are terribly misunderstanding something." Betty's smile faded. The other children looked at Miles like their faces turned into pale masks. They finally noticed that something was wrong, but they still didn't want to admit it. Will you let us go?" asked Betty in a more uncertain tone. "Of course, sweetie, of course," said Miles, but he didn't do as they promised. He stepped to one of the shelves instead. He was seeking a bit while the children heard the clattering of metallic tools. Jenny and Betty tried to look behind their back, not to lose him out of their sight. But Miles had already returned next to them, with a large hammer in his hand. "I will let you run free because we will play a game." He smiled at them again. Finn shivered. Miles's voice was really weird. His face looked nice and friendly, but his voice, it had some playful and still cruel tone in it, which sounded very menacing. The others were sitting there, frozen. They also felt it. They couldn't handle that something was horribly wrong with the nice Mr. Miles. Finn tried not to think about it. He was focusing on the escape. His hand slipped suddenly from the loop. He was free, but he pretended as if he was still tied up. He hoped the others also working on loosening their bondage, but it seemed like they are so powerless from fear, like that of a rabbit, lighted by a headlight. "If they can't free themselves, I can still run away and call some help." Miles didn't shut the door. "I will run out and cry for help." If he would be able to do this, the guard would probably run after him and leave the others alone, or he would be afraid that Finn will uncover him, so he would run away from here and let them go. The boy didn't want to waste a single thought. What did Miles mean by playing a game? Cla?" asked Betty. Her voice was slow and weak, probably from shock. She finally realized that the friendly Mr. Miles didn't come here to help, but she still couldn't accept it. "Yes, and it will be fun," smiled Mr. Miles. No, it wasn't a smile, it was a grin, and he stood behind Betty's back. The girls tried to turn around so they wouldn't lose sight of the man who still hadn't finished talking. "At least, I will have great fun." His voice had some dreamy tone for now, and without noticing it, he touched Betty's hair and curled one of her locks around his fingers. "It's gonna be a fun day." Seeing Betty's shiny hair lock around his hair made Finn very disgusted. "Let her go," he cried. "If my father learns of this, you will go to prison." "Really?" asked Miles, and he looked at Finn with his snarly smile. He let go of Betty's finger out of his hand, came round the desk with 2 steps and stopped behind Finn's chair. He took his hand on the boy's shoulder, making him braver not to let him notice the loosened loop on his arms. "But your father is not here, young pirate," Miles whispered into his ears with his rusty voice. "Only you are here. And me." He left the hammer on the desk earlier, while he was playing with Betty's hair, and Finn was thinking out a way to grab it. "Why are you doing this to us?" said Joey with a shaky voice. "We didn't. Or is it because we damaged Toy Foxy?" Finn was surprised. He never thought this could be a reason. So did Miles. He let Finn's shoulder loose and let out a bushed laugh. "You mean the Mangle? Come on, why would I care for such a crappy robot?" This didn't sound like the words of a responsible employee of Fazbear's, but they already had to think a lot of things about Miles, who wasn't the person they thought he was. "You are here because I wanted you to be here," said Miles, and gave them his repulsive grin. He walked back to the other side of the desk, and took one of his hands on Ben's head, while the other on Betty's. "Do you have any idea how long I seeked out the opportunity to be together like this?" He fondled Ben's hair and looked down the boy with a face which could be nice if it wasn't so hungry. "Sorry, young man, if I ruined your birthday party, but don't worry. I will keep this memory with love. It will be a night to remember for you two." Well, it would be, if you would survive this night. This was the moment when Jenny started screaming. It was a shockingly sudden and loud sound. It cut the silence as a knife. It also ended their dullness too. They all started twitching and screaming. Miles was just smiling. Then he took the hammer and struck it to the table. The glasses gave out a tingle sound. The hammer sprung back and hit Ben's plate. The scream stopped as they gasped. "Scream!" Miles suddenly started to yell, buckled over them like a predator. "Isn't it such a fun party?" He grabbed Jenny's hair and yanked her head up, forced her to look into his eyes. "Are you bored? Aren't you?" "No. No," sobbed Jenny and tried to look away, but when he pulled her hair again, much rougher, she cried out. "That's more like it," said Miles, satisfied. With his normal voice again, he pushed Jenny's head back, but so hard that it knocked on the desk. "It's a party. Let's have fun." Finn took a secret glance at the hammer. If he could grab it. If so, he would have to reach over the desk and Miles could easily notice it. "I guess you don't care, but I'll tell you anyway. My birthday will be early in September, chattered Miles while he was loosening Joey's binding. The boy cowered, his eyes full of tears. Finn decided that it's time to act, but he made a last attempt to convince Miles with some nice words. Please, he cried, why do you want to hurt us? Did we hurt you? Let us go, and we won't tell it anyone, like you did with the toy Foxy. Are you trying to manipulate me? Said Miles in a voice like it was entertaining him. But his pale eyes narrowed. Such a shame that you didn't convince me. Then, screw you, exclaimed Finn, and he striked for the hammer as fast as he could. This sudden move really seemed to surprise Miles, but sadly not as much that he forgot to duck when the boy tossed the hammer to him. It landed on the floor after bouncing back from the wall. But it didn't hit anyone. Finn didn't care at all since he only needed the hammer as a distraction. He jumped and ran to the door, which was still ajar. Don't leave us, Finn, screamed Betty behind him. He heard more scared cries and then the terrified voice of Joey. Please, stop. Finn didn't want to stop. He knew he is not helping the others if he comes back, but that terrified voice didn't let him go. He stopped in the door and looked back. Miles was holding Joey from his throat and lifted him up from his chair. The boy's hands were still tied behind his back and he was shaking in every limb. Miles was holding him with one of his hands, and in his other hand there were the hammer. He grinned like the big bad wolf from the fairy tale. Come back, young pirate, or I will beat your friend to death right now. He said this with a sickeningly friendly voice. Finn didn't want to go back. He knew it was a horrible idea. His mind told him not to do it. He will not give up himself to this evil man who will kill Joey anyway, no matter if he goes back or not. But his heart told him to do everything if there is a tiny chance he could save his friend's life. So he walked back, his legs trembling, and he felt Miles' cold, pale eyes on him, but he didn't look that way. He knew if he would look into those insanely happy eyes, he would turn away and never return. You've passed the test, said Miles when Finn stood behind his chair again. I tell you, I wasn't sure if you would return for your friend. You are braver than I thought, but such a pity. Even if you wouldn't return, you couldn't escape. I closed the other door at the end of the corridor. I'm not an idiot, you know. At least I won't die as a coward. The thought passed Finn's mind, but he discarded it. How can he even think something like this? We will not die. I won't let us. The others were sobbing quietly, but now hope returned to their eyes. They looked at Finn like a hero, but Joey was still in Miles' grasp and he started to beg. Please, would you let me go? He asked meekly. You see, Finn has returned. Miles looked at him. His eyes were speculative, like he was not quite remember that the boy was still in his hand. Of course, he muttered. It's time to let you go. The kids risked a shy smile, and Finn started to feel that tension leaving him. But suddenly Miles pushed Joey really hard onto the desk, who hid it with his face since he couldn't cover it with his hands tied behind his back. He cried out painfully, and tried to stand on his feet, but then Miles swung the hammer. Finn felt like he was observing it in slow motion. He couldn't turn away, and he couldn't close his eyes. He could only stare at the horrible scene where the metal head of the hammer smashed into Joey's temple. Blood splashed out in a thick stream, painted vivid red stripe on the desk. The hit was followed by a loud cracking sound, like it was the shell of a really big egg that was broken. But it wasn't an egg. Oh no. And Joey was screaming in a strange, erratic way, and blood splashed again. This time its sound were dull and wet, and Joey didn't scream anymore. But his right eye didn't look into the same direction as the left, and his limbs were trembling, and there were black hair in the blood on the hammer's head. Finn stood there, frozen, like all his insides had turned into ice. The horrified faces of his friends were only a bunch of white spots at the edge of his view. He wanted to run, to hide or to throw up, but he couldn't move at all while he was watching his best friend being beaten to death by a man who they thought was a really nice guy compared to an adult. Miles hit Joey's head again, although the boy was not moving anymore, and then he leaned on the table, breathing heavily. Above the bloody corpse, he looked like a predatory animal, crouching over his prey. Meanwhile the children started screaming again, or maybe they were screaming all along. Finn wasn't in a state that he could listen to it. Miles looked them up and down, grinning wildly, and then he looked at Finn. The boy almost collapsed from fear, but his legs started to move and he walked back, towards the door. He wanted to run, far, far from this bloodthirsty madman, from the bleeding remains of his friends, from the screams. Finally he turned around and started to run, slowly approaching the exit. But he wasn't fast enough. A rough hand grabbed his shoulder and jerked him back. Finn would have fell if Miles hadn't had such a strong grip. The boy saw his fingers, the red of Joey's caked blood under his nails. This filled his soul with horror and with renewed strength. Fueled by fear, he trampled on Miles' foot. He shouted, his fingers loosening on Finn's arm, and he got free from his grasp. He started to run again, faster, but it didn't help. "Come back here, you little shit!" Miles yelled, and with a snarl on his face, as he ran after Finn. He heard his footsteps behind him. They were really close. He almost reached the exit when Miles grabbed him again. His fingers, his bloody fingers, dug into his flesh, and he tried to force him to step back. Finn clambered into the doorframe, but Miles grabbed his hair too and started to be even more violent. Finn bent his neck, tried to dig his shoes into the ground, but all was vain. "You are a tough guy, young pirate, aren't you?" Miles panted while trying to force the boy's fingers off the doorframe, and grabbing his neck with his other hand. "You don't want to make me angry, do you?" Finn's fingers went white, his muscles tightened, but he couldn't get rid of Miles. He was more and more violent. He almost tripped the boy from the doorframe. Finn tried to kick or trample or bite, but Miles was more careful. He held him tightly by his neck and hair. Finn was flooded by terror. He suddenly saw Joey's last moment again, the moment when he was still alive, and he started to cry. "Oh, so that's how tough you really are," Miles babbled bitingly when he noticed that Finn is crying. His voice was full of evil satisfaction. The boy started to hit the arm which was holding him with his fists, but it was as less use as hitting the wall. They returned to the table and Miles grabbed the hammer again. Finn took a last glance to his friends, his eyes hazy with tears. He saw that they are talking, but their voice didn't reach him. He only heard his frantically pounding heartbeat. He saw Jenny and Ben crying, and Betty lying on the table, fainted again. "Goodbye," he uttered, but he knew they can't hear him. He didn't want to die, and didn't want to scream to make this evil man enjoying his fear. "You can't save them, Pirate King," Miles panted in his ears before he turned him, face to face to himself. The last thing Finn saw before the hammer smashed his face was Miles' crazy eyes and snarling teeth. Barney wasn't sure which murder was more interesting, the first or the second. The first boy was pathetic. He was so terrified that when his end came, he couldn't believe it. He could see it in his eyes. The second boy, Finn, was terrified too, but he tried to resist, and this made the game longer and with full of challenges. Probably the second murder was better, less fear, more fun. He didn't expect less from the young gang leader. Of course, the very ending was almost the same. He tried to hit his temple, but the little shit moved his head so the hammer hit him above his eye. The first bash broke his skull behind his brow, but with such a force that it made his eye pop out and the hammer's head sunk into his brain. It wasn't easy to pull it out. Barney was a bit disappointed that he accidentally killed the boy with the first hit, but he reminded himself that at least before his death they had some fun, and there are 3 other kiddos too. But he hit Finn's head again, just in case, and to feel the vibration of the metal as it hits the bone. Barney's clothes were bloody. It covered his arms up to his elbow and there was red spots on his shirt too, but it didn't bother him, to be honest. He wanted to change to clothings. He had a set of clothes with him that was besides his uniform and his normal clothes, but he completely forgot it. Now it was too late for that. He pushed Finn's dead body to the floor, face down, and a row of blood started to flow out of it immediately. Barney turned back to the table. Betty, the little sweetheart, was fainted, with her face on the desk. Her brother was gone. Realizing this made Barney feel uncomfortable for a moment, but he also knew that he couldn't leave the area. The corridor's door, which leads to the storage room, was locked. He will take care of him later, making a little hunt. Now it's time for the blonde girl, and this time he wanted to use some slower methods. Jenny was silent from terror. Her eyes were red from the tears and snot was dripping from her nose. Barney took the back of her chair and moved her further from the desk, then started to circle around her with slow, thinkingly steps. Jenny stared at the hammer mesmerized, and she let out a whimper, too quiet to understand. "I'm listening, darling," said Barney, and he stopped before her bestridden. He hid the hammer behind his back. Jenny was just staring. He didn't make any voice, just breathed really fast. Barney towered over her, smiling, enjoying the fear he caused. He could barely believe that his dreams came true. Here are 5 children, well, only 3 by now, who only listen to him and fear him, and he has full control over them, causing them pain or giving them false hope. He enjoyed that he didn't actually need to hit them to make them terrified. His words and gestures do the job too. But this time he didn't want to spare physical actions to the end of the show. He wanted more than just verbal attacks. He wanted to warm up before the lethal hit. But first he wanted to see how desperate the girl is, how much lies could take just to make her believe she will be safe. "Please, don't hurt us," uttered Jenny with a shaky voice. "Let us go. We won't. We won't tell it to anyone." "What if," said Barney, and stroked her face, "we would make a little race?" His fingers left bloody strokes on her face. She turned her face away with a shudder. "I thought," Barney continued, "that I will let you, but only you, to go back to your family. My only terms is that you need to reach the door before I do, and of course, not to talk with anyone about our little private party." "But Betty," started Jenny, but when Barney raised his hand as a warning she shut her mouth immediately. It was such a warm, heartening moment. "No, no, only you. I will chat with her later, when she is awake. So what do you say? Are you in?" He made his smiley face again, knowing that this, along with his bloody clothes, could be a horrifying look. Did he convince Jenny, or will she protest? It was an interesting question, and he was eager to hear the answer. "Yes," Jenny uttered, and felt her eyes. "What did you say?" "I didn't hear it," said Barney nicely, but with his voice upraised. He wasn't really surprised, but in the darkness of his heart, he was really happy that she gave up on her friends so easily. It was such a heady feeling that he could make her so terrified. "Yes, I'm in," said Jenny, but still with a quiet voice. She sniffled to prevent crying. "Oh, okay," said Barney, and started to untie her. "But stop sniffling. It's disgusting." "I will," Jenny wept. "Good girl." The rope fell off from Jenny's arms, but Barney grabbed her tightly to not let her make something foolish. "Before we start, I ask you not to forget about our deal. You can't speak a word about this to anyone. When they ask, tell them you got stuck in a box and couldn't get out. You can also tell them it was me who freed you." He smiled again, even if she couldn't see it. "But if you tell to anyone that you thought you saw, I will be mad, and you don't want to meet me when I'm angry, do you? So, can we start the race?" Jenny nodded wildly. Barney led her toward the door, but not past the desk, and started counting. "Ready, set, go." Jenny broke into a run. Barney had no intention to reach her right now. He followed her with a slower pace. She didn't listen to his words as she ran towards the door. Maybe she wasn't paying attention, or she just didn't remember. Jenny reached the door in seconds, and pushed and pulled the latch. The massive door didn't open. The girl was still crying. Her face was wet and red as she was trying to force the door open. It didn't open, of course, but it wouldn't be a good idea to run back because Barney was approaching with a smile on his face. "Please let me out. I was first," said the girl with her voice choked. She tried to be strong, but she seemed more like the cornered, trembling victim she was. Barney approached her, slowly, to watch her terrified struggle longer. She was so small, so vulnerable, so scared. It made him feel a pleasing, almost sexual fever in his body. And he hasn't hurt her so far. But now, killing the boys was only a warm-up. He wasn't interested in them so much as the girls, and since he hadn't seen any blood before hurting them, he wasn't turned on. But now he had his real prize, the smaller, weaker children, who are more entertaining to play with. Jenny gave up opening the door and she raised her teary eyes on him. "You said if I will be the first." and she went silent. She knew this would happen. "Really? Well, I lied," said Barney, and he reached for her. He saw in her eyes the pain of betrayal and then the pain when he grabbed her hairlocks. But fear made Jenny stronger, and made her numb to the pain of her hair being pulled with his hand. With a sudden move, she slipped under his arm and, without any better idea, she started to run backwards. Barney turned around with a beastly smile. "So you wanna play, huh?" he said, and ran after her. Jenny wanted to go back to the storage to free Betty, but she saw that he was too close. If she tried to run into the room, he could reach her in seconds. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't stop, and she found herself trapped in the other corner of the corridor. She tried to hide in her despair, but she couldn't. She also couldn't run away because Barney was too close. He blocked the way with his body. He grabbed her arm and pushed her roughly to the wall. Jenny squealed in a high-pitched tone, which made Barney push her again because he really enjoyed that terrified little voice. Her voice echoed shrilly through the empty corridor. "You can scream louder, if you want." Barney winked at her and then licked his lips. "I like how it sounds." Jenny wasn't in a state to completely understand the words she just heard, but the tone of his voice scared her, so she stifled her screams. She tried to stop crying too, like she is hoping if she is not doing those voices, it made her uninteresting for this evil man, and he let her go. "What? No screaming?" Barney asked. "You want me to give you a reason to, don't you?" He raised the hammer and smashed, this time, not her head but her shoulder. The tiny bones cracked like porcelain plates, and the blood made Jenny's shirt scarlet in seconds. She squealed again. Her voice was harsh and hoarse, and her eyes bulged like they are about to pop out. It was so beautiful. Barney's mouth was dried. He panted like he was running a few hundreds of meters while he was staring at the struggling, bleeding little girl. The scent of her fear and her blood influenced him like a dope. He wondered why she hadn't fainted already, but this means she was stronger than he thought. It's good. He didn't have to wait or wake her up, but he wanted to have some fun with her, which means she will probably faint sooner or later, so it's better if he doesn't waste any time of her consciousness. He raised the hammer again, this time aiming for her little fingers, but then a strange, sharp female voice cried somewhere behind him. "Get your hands off her, you dirty bastard." Jenny felt pain which she never thought she will ever have to feel, both in her soul and in her body. She was observing the deaths of her best friends, tied down, as they were beaten to death by a man she thought was kind and friendly, and who also hurt her too, without any reason. The pain in her shoulder was also unbearable. She felt the tiny bones grinding together even by her smallest moves. It felt like her shoulder was screaming too. She felt dizzy. She felt her stomach trembling, but she didn't faint or throw up, even though she could barely stand on her feet. If he didn't hold her so tightly, she would have fallen to the ground. Yet she was still conscious. She tried to prepare herself for the pain, but she knew she couldn't. She will squeal. She will beg, and maybe then she will faint. Please, no, she thought. Even her thoughts were trembling, but she could keep them together. I can't faint. If I do, I will lose all hope to ever be able to escape. She tried not to look into his eyes. She didn't want to provoke him, and didn't want to see that beastly smile. She knew if she would see that, she would give up. This man ... this monster can't be the nice Mr. Miles, the one who didn't want them to be in trouble because of destroying Toy Foxy. This grinning, wheezy beast with his hands slippery from sweat and blood. It can't be him. This beast, who was grinning when the boy's blood splashed on him, and when Jenny was screaming so loudly that she thought her throat will break. Even his voice didn't sound the same. Mr. Miles had friendly, kind voice, and this one's was rusty and breathy, similar to a large predatory animal. She saw something moving from the corner of her eyes, and as she looked at it, she saw as he raised the hammer again. She huddled herself up, her muscles stretched like they could protect her from the pain. But the pain didn't come. She saw his momentum broken as he flinched and turned his head to the empty side of the corridor. His was battling for breath. His eye bulged and moved to one side to another as he heard something disturbing, and now he is searching for what caused it. Jenny didn't hear a thing. She was sure, even in her suffering, and the strange behavior of the man made her even more terrified. Miles suddenly looked back at her, with a sudden, wild move, and he pulled herself closer to him by her shirt. "What did you say, you little bitch?" he was almost hissing. The white of his eye were glowing in the dim light and he looked like a hunted animal. Jenny's throat was aching from screaming, so she couldn't answer, even if she knew an answer. But Miles wasn't patient, waiting her to utter something. "I asked, what did you say?" His voice sounded hysterical, and he seemed scared. The smell of his sweat reached Jenny when he was leaning closer to her, snarling, as he wanted to bite. "How dare you talk to me like that?" he yelled, and his spit on her face. "You little bastard, don't dare to call me that." Jenny was numb from fear. This new behavior of Miles was even more unpredictable and terrifying than the previous. "Do you think you can scare me? That's your plan, huh?" He snarled into her face and grabbed her hair, violently pushing her head up. "You act like you know everything, right? But you forgot who's stronger here, don't you? Let me show you." Jenny was watching as confusion left his face and rage replaced it. Miles grabbed her hair even more violently and raised the hammer again. He smashed, and everything was broke. And then he smashed again, and again, and many more times, and Jenny didn't feel anything. Her body was hanging lifeless, and didn't see after the first few hits that happy, evil grin returned to Miles' face. He hit the girl's head until the upper part of her skull disappeared, and he only stopped when he couldn't hold her by her hair because there were not enough from her head which had any hair on it. Betty had no idea for how long she was unconscious. As she became more and more awake, she felt as the horror was growing in her body like a big, cold parasite, freezing her from head to toe. She didn't understand why this was happening. This supposed to be a happy day, and this man, who hurt them, is he really Mr. Miles? But he was always so kind to them. He didn't betray them when they damaged that robot, and he always smiled at them. He even knew their name. But the blood. Joey. As she looked around, she saw feet in sneakers hanging out of the desk. "Oh no, Finn," she uttered. Her vision got dim. She didn't know it was from the tears or the approaching faintness. And what about Ben and Jenny? What if they are also Then she heard Jenny's voice. Actually, she heard a horrible scream which could belong to Jenny. It sounded like it came from a girl's mouth. Then Miles was yelling. I asked, "What did you say, Kama?" And then more screams, more yelling, and some cracking sound which she didn't want to know what it was. And then everything was silent. No screams, no yelling, just a few more splashing sound, and it was over. Betty knew. What the silence mean? Jenny is dead, and the next one is. Her whole body trembled as she was waiting helpless for the killer to come for her. She had no idea how long she was waiting, but suddenly Miles stood in the door, slowly walking in. His clothes were bloody. The purple fabric was almost black on his arms where most of the blood splashed. It looked red only on his shirt. He noticed that Betty is awake and he smiled at her. It was such a horrible smile, because it seemed just as friendly and nice as it used to be. There were some confused hunger in his eyes, but otherwise, his face didn't seem evil. It didn't look like the face of a man who had just massacred 3 children. Betty was sitting and staring at him. Her chest tightened. She didn't even dare to breathe. Her eyes caught the hammer, which was dripping from blood, and then she couldn't look elsewhere. Miles noticed where she was looking. "We won't need this," he said softly, and he dropped the hammer. It hit the ground with a hollow sound. Miles stepped to Betty, who hunched herself and closed her eyes. "If I don't see it, it doesn't exist," she thought, desperately trying to believe in it. A hand, soggy with blood, stroked her hair and touched her locks. Betty's eye opened violently. She let out a disgusted scowl, but she stifled it immediately to not make him angry. Miles giggled, playfully and happily. "You don't have to be such a skittish little cat. I won't be so harsh with you." His hands were unbinding Betty's tie. Her shoulders were shaking from fear, and she let out a terrified groan. Miles bent over her. His body casted a dark shadow as he was cozying up with his hairy face to her pale little face. "Okay, we are done," said Miles, again with his hideously gentle voice. The tie was gone and Betty tried to break out, but all in vain. Miles grabbed her arms and pulled her to himself, while pressing her legs to the back of the chair with his knees. The chair back pressed into her stomach painfully as she was struggling, helpless. Her head was so close to Miles' chest that she felt his strong, fast heartbeats. It had almost the same rhythm as Betty's scared little heart. She tried to stifle her sobbing like as if she would make no noise. She would become invisible too. Seconds passed. Miles held her torso tightly to himself and stroked her hair with his other hand, breathing heavily. His hot breath ruffled Betty's hair. His chest was moving up and down forcefully, and his weight pressed the chair back into Betty's stomach so hard that she could barely breathe, and even in the wind she could take was no thanks. She could only smell his awful, beastly sweat. Miles stroked her hair more and more roughly. Now it wasn't even a stroke but a pull, and he made some strange, whimpering noises as if he was in pain. This made Betty even more terrified. Suddenly the hand in her hair tightened its grasp and pushed her on the desk by her hair, facing towards him. Betty screamed. Her legs were wobbling until Miles captured them with his knees. Betty felt his other hand on her neck, his fingers grabbing her throat. She tried to work them off, but her tiny little fingers couldn't fight his brutish hairy hands. And there came the worst part. Miles bended over her, his matted hair hanging next to his face, WTH joy in his pale eyes. He leaned really close. His bitter stench hit her nose. "I tell you a secret," he muttered, wheezing jerkily. "You've always been my favorite. At first, it was only you I wanted to bring here, but you were so inseparable from your friends, so thought I would take you all. It was a great idea, wasn't it?" Betty felt some cold grip in her chest. The new, shocking thought freeze her whole body. Her friends. They didn't have to die. It was all my fault, forgive me. Her fingers slipped off from Miles' hands and she gave up fighting. She has no rights to live, not after her friends died because of her. Barney felt so much joy as he was finally able to hold Betty in his arm. He didn't want to smash her face in like he did with the other. He wanted to preserve her beauty till the very end. Her hair was so soft and shiny, it would be a waste to make it sticky with blood. He grabbed Betty by her hair to hold her head still so he could get a better grasp on her neck, her sweet little neck. The man didn't want to cause her any pain yet. He wanted to see the fear in the girl's beautiful face and he intended to make it last. As he held Betty, their faces were a few inches from each other. He whispered in her ear how she was always his favorite, that she was the special, and that her friends were only an obstacle to get to her. Barney knew the girl blamed herself for the deaths of her friends. He could see it in her face, the pain that can't be caused by physical injury, but something deeper, the pain of guilt. Her hands fell to her side as she closed her eyes, accepting her fate at the hands of the man she once trusted and giving up the life she felt she didn't deserve. Tears ran down from under her closed eyelids, but she didn't beg or cry out. It was just as beautiful as Barney imagined it would. No, it was even better. He loosened his grasp on Betty's neck so he could make the moment last. He stroked Betty's face and talked to her in a soft, tender voice. "No need to cry. It's almost over, I promise." The hard pulsation between his legs made Barney realize he had an erection, though he wasn't aware of it till now. He could feel the girl's small fragile body struggling underneath him, and the smell of her delicious sweat. He couldn't resist. He had to taste it. He licked Betty's face, tasting the mixture of tears and sweat. The intense throbbing in his loins was almost painful, but pleasurable. Betty winced and let out a disgusted groan. Barney decided it was time to end this before she ruins the moment. She had given him everything he ever wanted. Her fear, her anguish, her life. Nobody around to hear her last breath. Just him and him alone. This was all for him. Betty was all his, and nobody can take that away. His grip tightened around her neck and Betty started to squirm. Her body fought for the last nip of air. Although she was flinging about, her eyes remained closed. Even though deep down she had accepted death, her body refused to let her go. Barney didn't like this. He wanted Betty to look him in the eyes while her life slowly drains from her body. He wanted to see the gorgeous angel in her last moments as her soul departs to the afterlife. He wanted to be the last thing she sees. But no matter how hard Barney squeezed, Betty refused to open her eyes. Barney didn't give up though. He needed this to end the way he had fantasized, and he refused to let her ruin it. I have to tell you something. He loosened his grip a bit. You know, I only killed your friends because you wouldn't leave their side, right? They really didn't have to die because you were the one I wanted, not them. Well, I guess you can say they were a great warm-up. Betty's eyes shot open with a new wave of horror shining brightly in them. Barney didn't wait any longer. He dug his fingers deep into her neck. Betty's body tensed up. Her eyes bulged from their sockets. A horrid rattling noise emitted through her throat. Barney was nearly on top of the girl as he pulled her even closer to look deeply into her eyes. His hands were slippery from sweat, but his grip on the girl's throat was still tight enough to prevent her from breathing. Betty's squirming became weaker and weaker. Her back convulsively tensed up. Now at his peak, Barney ejaculated. It was so sudden and almost painful. He twitched a bit and his legs became weak. He collapsed onto Betty's lifeless body. As he slowly released his grip on Betty's neck, he could see purple ligature marks that were left behind by his strong hands. Barney trembled with excitement at the aftermath of his brutal slaughter. Warm, sticky liquid oozed from his underwear and down his leg, but it didn't bother him. He was already covered in blood and sweat, so what's a little more grime added in? He looked over towards the table, where underneath lied the bodies of Joey and Vince. Blood splattered around them. On top of the table, like a sacrifice to some dark god, lied Betty's body. Only Jenny was missing from this symbolic image. Oh no! Fuck! Barney realized he had forgotten something. No! Someone, Ben, Betty's little brother, was still missing.